Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos al Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas. Mi nombre es Débora Dorotinsky y el día de hoy tenemos el honor de recibir a la doctora Sally STEIN. La doctora STEIN va a hacer una presentación que encuadramos sobre la fotografía color y Gisèle Freund y está encuadrada en el marco de la exposición Mexicrom. Tenemos el gusto de tener aquí al doctor James Souls, el curador. Esperamos que sea de interés de todo el público que hace seguimiento a la historia de la fotografía y al trabajo de la doctora STEIN. Y me da mucho gusto presentar a mi colega, la doctora Karen Cordero, cómplice en esta breve presentación. Karen, bienvenida. Nos va a presentar a la doctora STEIN.
Pues muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí y bueno, es un gran placer tener a Sally aquí después de muchos años que no ha estado en México. Bueno, un poco a nivel más personal, bueno, yo conozco a Sally desde que estuvimos juntos en el posgrado en Yale hace muchísimos años y es de mis personas favoritas en el mundo y además de las personas más brillantes que conozco. Es una inspiración. Entonces me da muchísimo gusto que haya aceptado compartir una pequeña parte de eso con ustedes, ¿no? Ya pasando a una presentación más formal, Sally STEIN es profesora emérita del Departamento de Historia del Arte de la Universidad de California en Irvine. Es investigadora independiente, residente en Los Ángeles y muy próximamente en Nueva York. STEIN investiga y escribe sobre la fotografía del siglo XX y también del XXI en Estados Unidos y en algunos otros lugares, y su relación con cuestiones más amplias relacionadas con la cultura y la sociedad. Ha escrito sobre los fotógrafos del Farm Security Administration del New Deal, en particular sobre Dorothea Lange, sobre quien tiene muchas publicaciones, Marion Post Wolcott y Jack Delano, así como sobre la controvertida imagen del presidente Franklin Delano Roosevelt. También ha publicado numerosos ensayos sobre los medios masivos de comunicación y el auge de la fotografía en color, y más recientemente ha escrito ensayos y capítulos para monografías sobre la fotografía de Gail Rebhan, Melissa Shook y Bárbara Ramos. Entonces me da muchísimo gusto presentarla para que nos hable también de otro tema que ha estado investigando sobre Gisèle Freund y también sobre el tema de la fotografía de color.
Thank you. Hola, and I'm sorry, my Spanish is minimal, so this is in English. Thanks to Karen Cordero Rayman, to Luis Vargas Santiago, to Deborah Dorotinsky, R. Rodriguez, and James Oles, who drafted me, and in particular James, who drafted me into his Mexichrome project, and thus lured me to visit while it is up at Bellas Artes. But since I only arrived yesterday, I have not yet seen it, but thanks to the fact that Karen already had a catalog, I have looked at the catalog, and that makes me even more eager to see it in the next 2 days. Okay, and if I'm speaking too fast, which sometimes I do because I'm originally from New York, or because I don't want to be boring, please go, hey, slow, and I'll slow down. Photography was the definitive title Paul Strand gave to his modernist manifesto of 1917, so now 125 years ago. Among his proscriptions, color and photography have nothing in common. For most of his life, Paul Strand stuck to this monochrome credo. According to Philadelphia Museum curator Peter Barbary, who organized the most recent 2014 Strand retrospective, this photographer only made a few color exposures when Eastman Kodak pressed him in the late 1940s to try some Ektachrome sheet film, part of Kodak's attempt to get famous names on board with color. And it didn't really work with Strand or Weston or Adams, except Adams used it a little, chiefly for commercial work, whereas Weston and Strand eschewed or avoided such jobs. Against this model of Strand's consistency in terms of black and white, I here consider the far less consistent case of Gisèle Freund when it comes to color and photography. And in fact, I had been working on this when Jay first approached me about the Mexichrome project. And I'm really dealing today with a period before she is in South America, let alone in Mexico. But it seemed to me that it was relevant to think about how is it that some photographers shift to color after they've maybe declared their allegiance to black and white photography. I here consider the far less consistent case of Gisèle Freund when it comes to color and photography. That difference aside, I find some notable similarities between Strand and Freund. Both internationalists enjoyed productive lives spanning much of the 20th century as well as the globe. Strand living from 1890 to 1975, and Freund from 1908 to 2000. Each not only made enduring photographs, but also wrote influentially about the medium. Also, both throughout their lives were committed leftists, each career even containing a link or nod to John Heartfield, such as you see here with Strand's one anti-fascist homage to Heartfield from 1938, and also Freund's contribution to a book that had a cover by Heartfield, the Brown Book, which was the first attempt to expose the horrors of National Socialism to the world. It came out in many languages. Yet Freund, unlike Strand, undergoes a palette shift between 1936, when in the first dissertation ever produced on the medium's history, and that was hers, she discredits any sign of applied color as crass stain on early photography. And now I give a rough translation of a few telling passages in that 1936 published dissertation. All new inventions are conditioned on experiments and prior knowledge. And here I emphasize, and by equal measure, the needs of society. It is the needs of society, she argues, that really develops photography and develops most other innovations. And when there are innovations that don't match a pre-existing need, they usually at that time don't take off. They might take off later. Also, photographers' chief collaborators in the 19th century were the specialized hand colorists. For colored photography had become the leading fashion or vogue to satisfy the bourgeois who economized with photography versus painted portraits. The ingenious operators colored their prints with irresistible pinks and blues that were, and here she puts in quotes, completely natural. The sarcasm, I think, embedded in her own italics. Here, stressing the artifice of color as a faddish rage, she seems to echo Strand's dictum from 2 decades earlier, 1917, that photography and color have nothing in common. But then, just 2 years later, she begins in 1938 using color film with great determination and success, even having a color portrait of James Joyce on the cover of Time's 8 May 1939 issue. Some might attribute this about-face to feminine vacillation or caprice, yet that's hardly apt with Freund, whose radical life defied reigning conventions, social, political, and sexual. Am I loud enough? Too loud? Fast? Too no? It's okay. How then to understand this hairpin reversal from chromophobia to chromophilia? In none of Freund's memoirs and interviews in the latter years of her life did she explain her color conversion in her late 20s in the last years of the 1930s. Repeatedly, she claims a lifelong passion for studying faces, yet she insists with an objectivity that ran counter to the conventions of the period. She pointedly abhorred the need for retouching to beautify the model so your clients resemble movie stars. But I ask, doesn't her preference for color film contradict her insistent repudiation of glamour when, especially in the 1930s, that was the dominant purpose for color printing and photography. And I'll get into this later. About her color adoption, she only states, and I quote, and I take a little water, "My color photographs entailed considerable expenses." She writes, "I could not sell them to newspapers and magazines," and she writes this in later memoirs, "which were without the means to reproduce them. So all those I photographed free of charge out of friendship," which happens to be Freundschaft. "The undertaking proved to be quite a burden, with color film costing far more than ordinary black and white." And that's true. The basic film usually costs 6 times more than black and white film at the time, and was, as I will say in a minute, much slower. Here, I think she pleads an excess of altruism. I actually think she's kind of lying. I'm sort of fabricating to herself as well as to others. Not only did she quickly secure some paying portrait commissions, but she refers only to the French press being not yet primed for color or full color, omitting her own late 1930s contact with comparatively colorful US mass media. And that's the main topic I'll be discussing today. Since Freund's 2 histories of photography, the first from 1936, the second from 74, and only translated 5 years later into English, extending on her earlier study up to the last quarter of the 20th century, and with a broader international scope, are notably informed by Marxist attention to class and commerce. I want to, and I'm always a little vulgar, pose similar questions to her own practice. Was it impractical love, as she would have it when claiming my own enjoyment as color motive, or more pragmatic money and career issues that led to her pioneering pursuit of photographic portraiture in color? However formative in her life, here I condense some key background issues. Born in Berlin in 1908, she was privileged grandchild on her mother's side of a recently prosperous German Jewish clothing manufacturer, which business her father was groomed to take over as the son-in-law, since there was a brother who died of the flu at the end of the war. However, Julius Freund had more passion for art and art collecting than business management. He drove the business into the ground. Although Gisèle, originally Gisela until her emigration from Germany to France, preferred literature to paintings, she credits her father with exposing her to German romantic painters and even taking her to the studio of Käthe Kollwitz. Perhaps to encourage her visual side, since she preferred literature, Julius, the father, brought her a rather luxurious Leica miniature camera when she turned 20 in 1928. Late 19th and early 20th century divided skirts brought on a lot by the bicycle craze. Unfortunately, online I found no German examples, and the Dressel firm's archive was destroyed during the war, so we have nothing from them in terms of what they were manufacturing. Before considering Freund's early use of that precision hand camera, the Leica, the family wealth came from smart moves in the garment trade. The maternal grandfather had greatest success when around 1900 he took a chance on women's divided skirts. They were already popular in France, Britain, and the US. Not yet in Germany, but he looked over the border and thought, yeah, why not here too, when bicycles are gaining popularity even with women. And so he was, I guess, the first in Germany to do divided skirts. With bicycles all the rage, Wilhelm Dressel quite successfully calculated that this innovative fashion, already gaining ground in Britain and America and France, would appeal to adventurous females in Germany. Later, Dressel also promoted women's office wear in the teens, when women were entering the sort of white-collar industries as secretaries. The family stories of his canny response to changing women's roles likely nurtured Gisela's own innovative impulses. Arguably, too, her color conversion may be tied to that trade in textiles and women's fashions. Recall that the late 19th century was when the German synthetic dye industry, which really started in England, but for some reason, England decided to let all of its early dye chemists be bribed, sort of lured back to Germany, and to start new chemical firms in Germany like Bayer, which still exists today. When German synthetic dye industry achieved global supremacy, and the garment industry was a major venue for that new chemical technology of synthetic coal tar dyes. Indeed, while she herself was no fashion maven in the conventional self, though kind of fashionable as a new woman and at least bisexual or full-time lesbian, there were various marriages, but I think they were for convenience. To compensate for the quite stiff poses required of the very slow color film, she worked hard to enliven the portrait results by encouraging her subjects to don their most vibrant wardrobe choices, such as here with Colette from 1939. Already in her teens, she gravitated to the left, even more in her early 20s, when after a year at the University of Freiburg, she transfers to Frankfurt to study at its Marxist Institute for Social Research. Simultaneously, she joins a left youth group. She later resists being specific, much later, at the end of her life, about her early political affiliations, but the group was probably communist, judging from the signs in various demonstration pictures she publishes at the end of her life, and uses her camera to photograph street demonstrations and police attacks as politics polarized in late Weimar and the rise of the National Socialists. Tipped off in spring 1933, rather early, that she and her youthful associates were targeted by the newly empowered Nazis, Freund fled alone on a night train to Paris with some negatives of her most political shots secreted on her body. On arrival in Paris, she shrewdly delivers these photos to leading communist propagandist Willy Münzenberg. Thus, one of her earliest published photos, and I think you see it here with the red arrow. It's not very interesting, but it's a good documentation of attacks on workers who are demonstrating, appears in multiple editions of 1933's International Exposé of Nazi Terror, Brown Book, or Le Livre Blanc, or none of the graphic contributors got credit, although the cover by Hartfield was likely unmistakable to many on the left. That anti-fascist act accomplished in 1933, Freund gets settled in a garret in Paris and resumes her studies at the Sorbonne. She soon develops a friendship with Walter Benjamin, who had also taken refuge in Paris, a fellow German Jewish exile with much longer associations to the Frankfurt group, and with already one published essay from 1929 on photography. Thanks to her growing friendship in Paris with radical female booksellers, publishers and sometimes lovers, Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier, Freund also becomes acquainted with leading French and British writers. While first benefiting from family support, she makes do after they immigrate to London in reduced circumstances. Thus, while selling a poor chance shot of a female body recovered from a suicidal drowning in the Seine, there was huge depression in Paris, as there was also in the US at this time, while omitting reprinting that grisly grab shot. I've yet to find it in her French archive, and no one else seems to have either, even though there have been many publications on Freund. In 1935, she visits her family in England, where, following her brother's suggestion, she visits and photographs the depressed North, a series she shows to emigre picture editor, originally from Hungary, but then working in Vienna, Stéphane Laurent, who prints it in the October 5, 1935 issue of his first English journalistic platform, Weekly Illustrated. Note that the cover is printed in just 2 colors, not 4 colors, as we'll start to see in America in a minute. This published essay proves especially well-timed as Time Inc. editors out of New York in 1935, gearing up for their next magazine, dispatched to England Dan Longwell to promote Time Inc.'s newsreel venture, The March of Time. Overseas, Longwell simultaneously scouts for effective models and picture stories to better prepare for the debut of Life. This later becomes a court case as to how much Life is essentially ripping off from European sources and European editors, including possibly Stéphane Laurent, though he does not join the court case. That Time Inc. emissary must have proposed in 1936 that Freund be assigned to make a new coverage of England's depressed North, an edit then appearing in Life's issue of 14 December 1936. This fourth weekly issue focused most attention on the British monarchy. I think I should have changed, yes. In turmoil over the King's affair with a decidedly unsuitable, in their view, American divorcee, whose family home that we see, I'm sorry, I didn't bring yeah, we see here, this is her family home they researched, hardly compared with the Windsor properties, such as over here. I'm always very impressed that while many people speak about Life magazine as such a typically American magazine, the first 6 months, almost every other cover is devoted to what's happening in England with the monarchy. This has to do with Henry Luce's Anglophilia, but I just think we were the first country to rebel against the British, and yet this supposedly super American magazine becomes like crazy British during this time of the crisis in the Windsor family. Both of Freund's photo essays on social misery in North England were in black and white, and in a decade that made such graphic reportages nearly conventional, hers were competent if far from outstanding. Life's treatment of her work was inferdig or disrespectful. Some of her photographs reproduced with jagged edges as if torn from an album. The new Life, this is only the fourth issue, had yet to nail down its crisp layout style. Nevertheless, she surely received a good fee plus complimentary copies of that issue, though she never tells in any of her memoirs what she got and how that was much better than what she was getting from, say, View magazine for little stories she did for them. And if she had not yet seen any of the American mass magazines until late 1936, her encounter with Life would have been, in my opinion, eye-opening. The new picture magazine was beautifully printed at unprecedented speed for high volume quality offset printing. It was done in Chicago. There was a special train that brought it back to New York and throughout the country after the printing every week. The dark tones having a velvet finish, the light tones a contrasting luminosity on coated paper stock. However, that signature elevation of monochrome press photography also gave more distinction to the few pages of four-color printing. And note, even the back cover, here I got online from eBay for $15. Note that even the back cover has four-color printing for beech nut candy or gum. Even in 1930s America, hard hit by the Great Depression, color gained prominence in mass media and culture, while justifying their leading with black and white as the reigning sign of seriousness. And this was a time when the magazine stand was becoming increasingly colorful as other magazines tried to sort of pump their numbers with color covers. Life's editors still hardly excluded all color. For one reason, advertising pages printed in color were far more profitable. Also, with US consumers by the mid-1930s expecting a modicum of color in print and in mass culture, Life would have appeared simply stodgy without its editorial pages, including a few polychrome splashes. Thus, on assessing closely this, maybe I should take off this clip and it will make less noise. Let's see if that improves. Thus, on assessing closely this fourth issue, Freund, previously familiar, since she doesn't mention ever having seen Life before, with monochrome or at most two-color printing of photojournalism in Europe, must have been struck by the regal tone of the entire issue, which upstaged her story on Down and Out England. Worse, the color ad on the always dominant right-hand page over, very sorry, jumping the gun. The color ad here, facing the last page of her three-page story, diverted attention from the final image concluding her essay, as advertisements, especially ads in color and on the right-hand side, usually do. It's thought that in the West, we favor the right-hand page. If she interpreted this juxtaposition as an unfortunate collision with the American industrial appeal to instant gratification made more delectable in color, such dismissal was harder with other notes of color in the same issue. Color certainly enlivened life's coverage of surrealist art in this same issue. You can see the Dali, the Magritte. Somewhere between or beyond highbrow modern art and the bowl of chicken soup, looking, as advertisers used to say about color, good enough to eat, was the double-page story leading with a color shot of gold bars worth $2 million, the captions tell us. Color, in other words, was reserved for things deemed capable of generating quick sales like canned soup, or already certified as very valuable in the case of high art or gold bars. I can only speculate that after the signal accomplishment of having her Sorbonne thesis accepted and published, and a bit later even reviewed quite favorably by Walter Benjamin, it must have been discouraging to have no chance to find any teaching position, for she had been stripped of her German citizenship, yet lacked the necessary papers for regular work in France. She was, in essence, sans papier. Moreover, while she had dabbled for a number of years with press photography while working on her thesis, in which she had developed powers of discernment in ranking the most original 19th century photographers from the run-of-the-mill, she probably recognized that her own published assignments did not come close to the work of contemporary top-tier black and white press photographers, a number of whom she knew personally. She had known Robert Capa since he arrived in Paris in 1933, and surely followed his ascending career after 1936, when he began sending visual dispatches from the Spanish Civil War, this being from Vue, in September 23, 1936. Probably, too, she had early contact, we're not exactly sure when, with another leading photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson. Arguably, those two practitioners of miniature photography in natural light were in a class of their own with their on-the-fly riveting brilliance. And compared to them, her photography in black and white must have seemed comparatively lackluster. Thus, I'm proposing, this is not her claim, but I'm intervening here, that Freund's exposure to just a few uses of color suggested an alternative golden path, or to draw on the slightly later 1939 Wizard of Oz largely color film, though its bookended in black and white, Yellow Brick Road, to new professional distinction at a time when her situation economically, politically, and psychologically required a degree of independence. Remember, she is really without regular employment or any kind of citizenship. We all might question whether we are early or late adopters of new technology, or if our inclinations vary. I find, I'm sorry, I'm not used to the air here, and it's actually made my nose drippy, me a little coffee. I find my interest in early color somewhat paradoxical, since I was slow to get a cell phone and still resists much social media, as Karen and others can attest. They went, do you do what's up? And I went, what's that? However, being a terrible typist prone to countless errors of transposition, I was fairly early to switch from typewriter to personal computer, which offered the distinct advantage of making spot corrections without retyping entire pages, which is what I spent my entire life as an undergraduate doing. Thus, perhaps we should discard hard and fast blanket labels of early adopter or late adopter of new technology. Nevertheless, moving into the field of color photography around 1938 required great investment of effort along with supplementary costly equipment. For any trial with modern color photography presented even more obstacles for practical success in the late 1930s than black and white work with a small camera. The years 1935 to 1938 witnessed the introduction and marketing of the first two modern subtractive color films by Eastman Kodak, that's Kodachrome, and Agfa, which is Agfa Color Noir, and I don't have a picture of that here. Whereas all previous subtractive processes involved three separate exposures, both of these, which would then be layered on top of each other. Both of these new films, and you see it here, excuse me, here you see a rather portable three-color camera, which made three different color negatives. But as you probably know, with color film, unless you're too young that you never handled color film because you're already digital, it was all packed together in micro-thin film. Whereas all previous subtractive processes involved 3 separate exposures, both of these new films demonstrated the efficacy of highly technical integral tri-pack systems incorporating multiple layers of dye-coupled filters and films. With all these, and there were 7 in Kodachrome, with all these microstrata compressed into a single layer of flexible film, those separate stratum then being consecutively developed. Making positive prints in this era was at least as complicated, which is why most photographers using these integral tri-pack films either accepted the presentation mode of positive slide projections or else sought half-tone reproductions if their work was deemed worthy of mass consumption. Freund, in her later memoirs, noted that both Kodak and Agfa offered similar new color films that for the first time could be easily used in small cameras, without stating which she first tried, let alone the reasons for her choice. In fact, she sometimes said, I started with Kodachrome, and I don't think that's true. I've been to her archive in France, and this is not Kodachrome film. It is early Agfacolor Noir. But she wrote this when she was in my age now, and we all falsify or just forget, whatever. So the factors governing the choice could include issues of varying access. I think Kodachrome was less accessible in Europe up until the war, 39, with in terms of Kodachrome. Technological ease of use. Kodachrome could only be processed in Eastman plants, whereas Agfacolor Noir offered the possibility of self-processing or processing in a wider variety of independent laboratories or initial palette preferences. Kodachrome's dyes were highly saturated to the point of looking quite synthetic. You'll see that synthetic look, I think, in Mexichrome. Whereas Agfacolor Noir was so desaturated as to provoke quite a few complaints of colors being too faint or muddy. These are even Nazis sometimes writing back during the war saying, this is terrible color. Would you please get us truer colors? And in some ways risking sounding like dissidents when they're writing this. There is a film about one photographer, one German accountant, Nazi accountant, who was doing amateur photography, but sending some of his examples back to Berlin, who complained frequently to Agfa about how terrible the film was, and would they please improve it. Despite these differences between Kodachrome and Agfacolor Noir, and I should add one other thing, I did find in her archive when she offered to do some color work for the British at the beginning of wartime, and she sent a sample, and they went, this is so faint. Could you please up your colors? And I think that's another indication she was working with Agfacolor and not with Kodachrome. No one ever complained that there was not enough saturation in Kodachrome. Both of these early modern color films promised expanded possibilities of transcription offset by severe limitations in usage. Not only were both Kodachrome and Agfacolor Noir much more expensive than monochrome film stock, but also their reduced light sensitivity made them slower by a factor of 4 than existing black and white films, which meant that candid shooting, which the Leica and other handheld cameras had facilitated in black and white, was nearly out of the question. Freund readily acknowledged this difficulty in her Chronicle of Photographic Mastery. I quote, in 1938, color film required that a model pose far longer than today. Moreover, since I was bent on photographing writers in their homes, in their usual surroundings, instead of a studio or out of doors, I had to resort to artificial lighting. There was no question of taking snapshots. I often had to be inventive to get my writers to look natural. That account dodges manifest contradictions. Previously, she resisted older and larger cameras, which usually required added light and or a tripod, so that she might, with her miniature camera, capture the candid picture. However, once under the spell of color as pictorial priority, or professional priority, she adopts artificial light as indispensable requisite of her portrait practice. Furthermore, she often would bring to her sometimes skeptical sitters a projector to show them previous portraits, for color photographs were still a rarity, which means that unlike Kappa and Cartier-Bresson, she was traveling far from light, with a medley of machines that precluded spontaneity, I think she doesn't speak of an assistant, but I can't imagine that she, who was not very big, was carrying around projectors as well as tripods, as well as lights, as well as her camera and film on her own. While the goal may have been naturalism in all its chromatic variety, the appearance she achieved was itself highly contrived, as we all experience when super bright lights get switched on. Color might look more natural, or as she reportedly said, closer to life. But it necessitated many other forms of elaborate mediation and staging. Despite these impediments, by winter 1938, she had begun in earnest trying out, I believe, Agfacolor Noi in her 35mm camera. With some self-mockery, she later concedes that her first shots were the typical preliminaries of a novice seeking color motifs, a traffic light, a poster for Dubonnet, and a hairdresser's window, before crowing proudly that by her fourth attempt, she had managed to capture the face of France's then leading writer, Paul Valéry, and whom you see on the left. This led quickly to her envisioning a series in color on faces, not just ordinary faces, but those like Valéry's already minted as singular creators. Having hatched this plan of portraying leading writers with a new color film and enlisting the support of the supremely well-connected Monnier and Beach, the two bookseller publishers, she proceeded full speed ahead. Still, it's impressive that by spring of 1939, she had only started in 38. Freund's color portrait of James Joyce had star billing on the May 8th cover of Time. Joyce, in this image, wears a velvet jacket in a rich red hue, a hue perfectly matching, it seems, the magazine's standard Chinese red border. But the engraver surely retouched the clothing color, bumped it up. But little else is regal in this portrait. Joyce's posture is coiled instead of commanding. His shoulders for his failing vision with a magnifying glass, as well as thick spectacles. Remarkably, Joyce liked the result. Freund must have been thrilled by the added doors it opened, the fee-fur cover shot, plus, I don't know if you can even slightly see it, upfront credit. On the cover sometimes, but not always. Why am I reaching? Oh, sorry. Stop it. If you see bottom right below his hand, there's a little credit to Gisèle Freund. For any photographer of this period, this was truly a coup. Like the image of gold radiating premium value, her own plan with color had struck a rich vein, meaning Time magazine. Although Freund repeatedly wrote of a clear gulf between her passion for literary portraiture and the more prosaic press photography to pay the bills, her work in color actually served to bridge those fields. Hypercompartmentalization and early color photography careers. Where are we now in terms of time? I don't want to run too long. Okay. In striving to make a name and position for herself with color, Freund entered a quite strange arena of specialization in color. Less a unified field than a series of confining sideshows in a chromatic cabinet of curiosities. For early color photography exhibited a tendency to instrumentalize its practitioners as well as its motifs. Of course, Freund was not alone. Here I confine myself to just a few examples of other photographers in the 30s gravitating to or resisting the new prospect of full color photography. By the late 1930s, Roy Stryker, one well-respected innovator of governmental use of documentary photography in the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Farm Security Administration, was quick to link the mass media's increasing turn to color with the appeal of vulgar girly shots, or as he would say, cheesecake. For the longest while, when I started studying this many decades ago, I thought, cheesecake, why are they talking about pictures of cheesecake? And it took me a while to understand cheesecakes are half-naked girls. Probably unwittingly, for his knowledge of photography was more pragmatic than academic, Stryker was echoing Baudelaire's mid-19th century denunciatory association of early photography with the explosion of printed pornography. Arguably, the visceral aspects of color did spawn a new wave of pornography. Consider the example from On High of Paul Outerbridge, a greatly respected Modernist photographer whose black and white imagery had even been exhibited at Stuttgart's famed International 1929 Film und Foto exhibition. When adopting color as his preferred medium in this era, Outerbridge made some lucrative product shots for advertising, such as you see with the toilet paper ad. But he mainly concentrated on sexually explicit female nudes, sometimes coyly fetishistic, in a few instances, pointedly kinky SM poses. Give me a sec. Others concentrated their color efforts on fashion, theater scenes, or food close-ups, sometimes mixing these genres in exotic confections of women with fresh vegetables and fruit. The most commercially successful modernist, Edward Steichen, had a distinct penchant for such females cum flora color compositions, striving to achieve chaste and luscious notes simultaneously with numerous Orientalist allusions. Given Steichen's mid-50s family of man exhibit at MoMA, we think of him as a liberal, some would argue a Cold War liberal, and others a more progressive independent. But and I my late husband, Alan Sekula, saw him as a Cold War liberal. I actually think even the family of man is more independent in that it features Oppenheimer, about which there's a new movie, as who at the time had been blacklisted from doing any science work. And so I actually think it's a coded way of speaking about people who actually supported international anti-nuclear agreements, excuse me. Yes, you can disagree with the people you live with, as I often did with my late husband. But his lucrative color work evinces a rather decadent reactionary side 2 decades earlier, and this is especially true in center bottom row. This horrendous picture, but there are some other pictures like this, of enlisting a small black boy to wear just a kind of dhoti, and then this woman in a kind of lavish costume. This was in Vogue magazine. And again, with fruits. The boy is presenting her with, I can't see here if it's pears or bananas or what. While few photojournalists concentrated on depicting color in the Second World War, a number of publications in both Germany and the US did their best to drum up support for wartime mobilization by commissioning color shots of officers and armaments, especially for magazine covers in support of their respective nations' military might. No surprise that only the second time Life broke ranks from its black and white cover standard with a full color cover, the first in the last issue of 1937 as a kind of festive gift issue reproducing Ingres' Comtesse d'Aussonville from New York's Frick collection, was in mid-1941 as a way, was doing it also in mid-1941 as a way of trumpeting the news that its publisher and editors had finally decided to catch up with the urgent state of world affairs by endorsing US wartime mobilization. For most of the 1930s, Time Inc. editorial staff was not only, this isn't across the board true, but most were anti-New Deal as well as anti-communist, but provided editorial haven for a number of isolationists. At least one an outright Nazi sympathizer who finally was pressured to step down from the editorial team. So it was quite slow to support FDR's efforts urging the nation to join the Allied cause. But when Time Inc. came round, it did so with utmost pomp and circumstance, hailing its newfound readiness to join the battle with a life color cover by Elliot Ellis Offen of then commanding officer, later General, George S. Patton, atop a tank painted in his custom colors. I don't know what yellow is doing there, but maybe it's for visibility. The modern versions of color-saturated heraldry. Thus, on the brink of war, Life deployed color to grant highest honors to military might, as well as museum-sanctioned high culture and wealth neatly commodified. Once I paired these first and second full-color covers of Life, I could not avoid thinking of them as French arms meet American arms. Okay, the joke didn't go well. Altogether, these diverse arms, also referring to military armaments, Altogether, it still didn't go well. Altogether, these diverse outbursts of color photography seem to constitute the still photographic version of a cinema of attractions, a term that was introduced by film historian Tom Gunning, who characterized the first decade of motion pictures. Exhibitionism catering to the attention seeking without much claim to narrative coherence. There were, of course, many who refused to jump on the color photography bandwagon. I let others decide if they were angels, going where angels fear to tread, hidebound and knee-jerk traditionalists, or critics of the sensational pornographic potential, just to the point when black and white photography was gaining a foothold as a personally expressive print medium in the hallowed halls of museum art. Some photographers and their champions seemed downright chromophobic in their strong attachment to a world that should remain verily colorless in its image. There were also a few photographers who sought with variable success to maintain a critical edge to their vision when switching from black and white to color. By the late 30s, Stryker's remaining band of FSA photographers, by this time both Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange were no longer part of the FSA, still working for New Deal reform objectives, were at least a generation younger than their boss and also Dorothea Lange, and less inclined to dismiss color photography as lacking any redeeming social value. So they gamely sought to extend in color their New Deal style of documentary exposés of social conditions in dire need of assistance. This supplement to the much larger FSA archive of black and white social records of the Great Depression continues to shock many today as Depression trompe-l'oeil, treating the presence of color in the Depression world and its image as utterly at odds with the fundamental conditions of massive privation that nonetheless was festooned with a riot of commercial advertising, more and more of it in color, as we see here in Marion Post's color Kodachrome of the same scene that she did also in black and white. FSA photographer Marion Post Walcott's use of color not only emphasizes the way advertising served as the only form of decoration as well as signage for these dilapidated sheds serving African American businesses and their clients, it simultaneously highlights the reddish dirt in the foreground that in color cannot be mistaken for paved roads in this neglected side of Melrose, Louisiana. Post Walcott ended her FSA career with marriage just before U.S. entered World War II, but photographer Jack Delano, who continued documenting the nation in the early stages of the war, began using color to celebrate the role of heavy industry and its key workers, notably without veering into the cleaned up imagery of corporate advertising. He then went on to live and work in Puerto Rico, as hopefully some of you know already. The curiosity of color surfacing up from, no, I'm going to jump here. In the last decade, some other books have come out showing that there are weird amateur collections that have never been seen, such as The Day in Its Color and The Colors of Confinement. The one on the right being especially weird and inexplicable because Mambo was actually made these pictures while he was confined as a prisoner, as a Japanese American prisoner in the United States in a concentration camp, then called a relocation camp. Just as the Germans called many of the concentration camps labor camps. Since he never talked about his experience to his surviving son afterwards, I've spoken to his son. He goes, I don't know. My father wanted never to speak about this at all. So I have no idea how he got the money to buy Kodachrome film and then to pay for the processing, since it was not part of any government project. It was simply in his closet, and the son found it after the dad died. Of well-documented and equally well-respected professional careers that involves a sudden engagement with color photography in this period of the late 30s, consider finally, if briefly, the established large-format photographic practice of Elliot Porter. By 1938, Porter's black and white reputation seemed assured with a rare one-man show of monochrome landscape studies and still lifes at Alfred Stieglitz's An American Place. gallery. Shortly after this show was mounted, Kodachrome became available in larger sheet film sizes, not just 35. Porter greatly preferring large format film for its detail. Rather quickly, Porter made an abrupt shift, resuming his boyhood amateur photography of birds in situ, only this time with larger cameras using color film, aiming to make a color portfolio of birds in nature after a publisher advised that a photographic book of bird studies would not work effectively in black and white, was not sellable enough. Although Porter in subsequent decades became famous for his more capacious landscape views in color and the fine dye transfer prints he produced in his own studio, which was quite rare, which in turn helped support the Sierra Club and the environmental cause more generally, this turn began quite narrowly with a quest to use color to capture all manner of bird species in their natural habitats. Maybe Porter's birds are the closest we get to Freund's passion for faces in color, and not just any human faces, but those of leading writers, first in Paris, later in South America, and then whenever she found writers and artists in her far-flung travels, preferably in the habitats they made to facilitate their generative work. Reconsidered in this preliminary broader context, Freund was just one of these early adopters of new color film technology. Still, her conversion particularly interests me since it seems so at odds with her earlier deep disdain for color as photography's modish or fashionable camouflage of its essential objective character. Refiguring the face in color, love or money. Freund was just one of those who early adopted new color film technology. Her conversion, this is repetitive, sorry. However, I close by turning from pragmatic money to the countervailing weight of love. For ultimately, I think both were factors in Freund's color conversion. I refuse to think this is just crass professionalism and career orientation. The question remains, why depict writers in color? The trait of writers, after all, is the purposeful use of language, which tends to be materially limited by and large to black ink scribbled, first then typed, finally printed against white. If the writer's looks matter at all, shouldn't black and white suffice for them? Freund always gravitated to literary figures. Their business was precarious, and so was their status in an age that, being more and more mass-mediated, emphasized showy looks. The hero of her pioneering history of 19th century photography in France, Nadar, had enshrined, and I should have had a couple of his portraits of artists, enshrined the new thinkers and artists of his epoch. She wanted to do the same, but this time using color, decorously but vividly, to create a pantheon for her 20th century in which the chemical simulation of natural color promised a new optical currency. Moreover, like her grandfather's ingenuity in capitalizing on the bicycle craze with divided skirts in color, she seized on this opportunity as a most ardent supporter of progressive writers to both promote the beleaguered intellectual and find a semi-secure position in the increasingly crowded trade of photography. Indeed, before the US could dress up its new generation of soldiers with medals and armors, with that Joyce cover, she had done her part to declare the unsung heroes of humanity, its independent shapers of language and thought. Already, while completing her dissertation, she made a point of trying to document the 1939 International Congress for the Defense of Culture, organized in Paris by André Malraux, an historic convening of writers on the left determined to combat the spread of fascism. I think she was doing this hoping to be able to sell the work. She did not succeed in selling the work to any of the press at the time. It was an historic convening of writers on the left, but I think it also related to her love of left writers organizing themselves and speaking out. Alas, as Freund herself later acknowledged, the anti-fascist convocation hardly stemmed the tide. Indeed, in an age that started measuring significance by the corollary attendance of press photographers, recall her second book cover, which has a mass of press photographers going at somebody. Freund recalled that the distinguished gathering was only photographed by herself and one other photographer, Chim, later adopting the American name of David Seymour until he died prematurely in South America. I think he was on a bus that fell off the mountain. Ouch. Yeah. Just actually a week before Kappa was killed in Indochina. I mean, Magnum lost 2 of its leaders in the same couple of weeks, fortnight. Her photo series of the politically engaged found little exposure then, but only in her memoir decades later. Yet not long after, meaning she only published this in the 80s. Yet not long after that mid-30s convention, the portrait motif had a revival interest, and here's where I will end in a few more minutes. Among those figures of modernity committed to countering fascism with varieties of humanism. The mid-1939 double issue of Verve included contributions by Gide, André Gide and Paul Valéry, both key to the 1935 conference, also Michaud Sartre, among others. While this anthology had numerous silly images and essays on women as sweet emblems of civilization, numerous women contributed serious fare, including Adrienne Monnier, Freund, and Thérèse Bonnet, another pioneering modern woman photographer and writer. Overall, Verve's double issue on the portrait, which came out in 1939, made a strange tapestry interweaving sharp cries of alarm with softer threads of romanticism, using women as the motif of romanticism. Maybe this dissonance reflects the growing chorus wanting to address the portrait anew, when the spread of fascism and its sinister ethnic profiling made both faces and facial recognition so fraught with new dangers along with old primal comforts. Who knows why Verve's editor and publisher, E. Thériade, chose not to reproduce any of Freund's contemporary photographic portraits, because the book is filled with color pages. They did not economize on color here. The sumptuous quarterly had many color pages, yet it only allotted black and white pages to excerpt Freud's dissertation research on the Scottish portrait studies of 19th century painter and photographer D.O. Hill that you see bottom here on the left. At least Freud's ardent champion, Adrienne Monnier, who's right, oh, stop. Why is it doing that? Whose essay is In the Land of Faces, also contributed an essay that foregrounded Freund heroically as, I quote, intrepid pilot in the land of faces, adding color to her chemical toolbox while abjuring retouching. Against most rhetoric about the fugitive qualities of color in life as in art, here Monnier argues that Freund's color portraits effectively bring her subjects, it happens all the time, effectively bring her subjects back alive. That's a quote. Especially as the subject's eyes, in all their particular hues, command more attention, she argued, than the unretouched lines of the face. Monnier extols color's vitalism as antidote to any hint of monochrome photography's morbidity. Few serious writers advance this claim. A half-decade later, André Bazin, in the Ontology of the Photographic Image, which appeared as an essay in 1944, but only appeared in English decades later, grants no special case for photography's recent color offspring when he linked all photography to the mummy complex, Egyptian mummy. Quote, photography does not create eternity as art does. It embalms time, rescuing it simply from its proper corruption, end quote. 3 decades hence, Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida echoes Bazin while reserving for color the most damning condemnation. And I quote again, for me, color is an artifice, a cosmetic, like the kind used to paint corpses, end quote. Could there be a more withering aside, assailing color for its soulless masquerade of death as life? Notwithstanding these subsequent weightier voices, Monnier, in 1939, in Verve, mounts strong defense of Freund's pursuit of literary portraits in color, particularly in the late 1930s. Just the opposite of conformism when used to depict writers, color, according to Monnier, highlights the idiosyncratic. Quote, the most tortured scenes in the land of faces, the strangest, the least beautiful by the canons of contemporary beauty, end quote. Thus, color is championed by the far from glamorous Monnier, whom you see here in the left, but on the right side of that image, for its testimony to the free-thinking human spirit. Instead of smoothing and helping to polish the contours of the face, color in this argument underscores the irregular, the idiosyncratic. In support, Monnier cites none other than Sartre, who had been to a slide projection of a number of the French writer's portraits at the bookstore. Looking at the parade of all these faces, his own included, Sartre aptly commented, "We look as though we just came back from the war." This is in 39. Sartre might easily have critiqued the work with a sardonic comment that we look as though we were dead, presaging Barth's corpses made up to look their living best. Instead, Sartre alludes to those who survived war. The war hadn't really broken out yet, except in Czechoslovakia. Lived to speak of it, or in Spain, or maybe only bear the shock of mute testimony. This remark reminds us that war's prospect haunted the revival and reception of the conservative genre of portraiture when peace seemed unsustainable in 1939. We might think of Freund's adoption of color as a kind of war paint, not for the sake of belligerence, but rather to anticipate the suffering to come. Moreover, at this moment in the late 30s, when France only forestalled occupation in what was called the Phony War, a kind of standoff in 39, those like Freund, also Benjamin, who were stateless Jewish refugees, were especially vulnerable. I'm really coming to the end. Is it too far-fetched to consider that Freund viewed the addition of color to the portrait as salutary counter to the resurgent physiognomy and ethnic profiling systems of social classification in that period that had less use for color, as German physiognomy conventionally prized line, shape, and metrics? Now, I have been criticized, wait a second, think of all the racism and colorist racism, but especially in terms of German ethnic concerns, their priority in racism was how do we distinguish those who have infiltrated as Mischlings, as foreigners, our society, and this was really oriented toward Jews, and thus this obsession with fixing on the nose and other kinds of profiling, as well as actually a circumcision, which is not discussed here. The genealogical systems of social classification in that period had less use for color as German physiognomy conventionally prized line, shape, and metrics, as Richard Gray discusses in his study of German physiognomy about face. Color then might be seen as a warding off of the instrumentalized treatment of the face in this period of hyper-racialized thinking poisoning nearly all the world, and still poisoning much of the world. In retrospect, her application of color was more innocuous than inoculating. For the most part, it may have fueled a distinct passion in Freund to resolve her own need to maintain a life that ideally would combine a measure of security, but congruently with continued intellectual and political inspiration. In a recent critique, which actually is, the cover has a picture from Mexico she made much later of Frida. In a recent critique illustrated with a didactic mosaic of Freund portraits, co-author of this collection, Gabriel Costas, demonstratively concludes this photographer's repertoire to be quite limited. There is some merit to the charge of repetitive cliches, but it can also be countered as missing Freund's purposeful refusal of physiognomic extremes of debased, hyper-controlled mugshot and upright portrait of model leader, looking up at the model leader. Three aspects consistently figure in Costas's selection of literary portraits in color. Most often the point of view is from slightly above the head, not from below, empowering the viewer to look closely instead of inviting blind reverence. Just as frequently, a strong diagonal works as primary vector in her portrait selections. Costas also noted that the actual exposures from Freund's portrait sessions are more varied than the consistently edited choices she made, with the head tilting as if weighing a thought without predetermined certainty. And the hands are often reaching for or entwined with mouth, chin, cheek, or forehead. This assuredly is a rather conventional sign of grappling with thought since Rodin's Le Penseur, yet in these photographs it indicates viscerally a head not only attached to the body, but seeking against Descartes, reassuring contact with the body. Those features logically recur as Freund works to compose a distinct, invaluable community of intellectuals. So while I'm indebted to Kostas for making the point of the consistency and similarity and repetitiveness in the portraits, I think one can also make a counter argument to her reasons for doing that. Yes, we're very 1 minute from the end. By envisioning a way to give writers and artists more presence than glamour, she sought to revalorize their status in an age that debased thinkers in favor of the stars of stage and screen, and politicians in general starting to take their presentational cues from such media magnets of public attention. If now these efforts with color portraiture seem quaint, even absurd, and also just commonplace as defensive measures on the brink of World War II, in our current desperate times of political extremism, we might at least recognize the purposeful impulse to try new approaches and technologies to redirect the mass public's attention towards sources of thoughtful reflection. Thank you for your patience. You might have to press it to turn the green light. No, the green, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Well, thank you so much, Sally, for this extraordinary talk, which really bridged between so many different contextual, conceptual, technical, art historical, political contexts.
And commercial.
And commercial, yes. And I think there are so many things that were fascinating in both the subject matter and the methodology. So we'll open for questions, comments, protests. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Sally. That was very thought-provoking. And on that line, I do have several questions. One of them is if you know about when did color photographs enter art historical books. Because what seemed really interesting, what you were showing, particularly Ingres's portrait, is when did it work properly? When did color photography did become valuable for art history? So that would be one question. Another question, I think might have to do more with the technical aspect of color photography. And Otto Bridge was engaged with the Carbo process. So what happened with Freund on that front? Was she ever like experimental in the laboratory? Did that probably hinder her use of color or retard the use of color? And the last one comes from these last portraits you were showing. And I wonder if you can say something, and this doesn't just apply to your talk today, but to your thinking and discussion of portraiture and photographic portraiture. So what happens with this close-up photograph? In the case of Freund, what happens with this reduction of the person to the head and the hand, and probably the whole idea of gesture? What was she thinking about? Was she thinking about the gestures? And what do you think happens to the presence of an individual when the body is reduced to the head and the hand, and when the pose is almost eliminated, and when we are faced, literally, with a disembodied face? So if you could elaborate on that.
Actually, I really appreciate that question because I realize I should have explained that when Kostas does this mosaic, she's doing close-ups on the pictures by Freund, such as you saw with the Joyce and also with Valérie, They do show larger context. They are they are half figures. Usually, though in the case of Frida later, it's a full figure, etc. So she is interested in the body, but less so than the face, it seems to me. But the mosaic is misleading in terms of zooming in to try to emphasize the consistency of certain qualities that Costas wants to bring out, which I think is perfectly valid to bring it out, though I think there can be made a counter argument. In terms of your other question, Max Kozloff, who has an essay as well as some work in Mexico, mainly from just around Tijuana. I mean, he didn't spend a lot of time in Mexico. He went just south of the border, and Mexico City also. In the mid-70s, he in Artforum, where he was an editor as well as a writer, did speak about that art history was only then beginning to change in terms of, he doesn't really refer to books so much, but I think it's an excellent question that you bring up. Color becomes much cheaper and manageable to deal with this expense when you have big production lines, volumes. The unit cost is much cheaper then. So art history books, at least in the US, and I can't say, when you start having these textbooks, Gardner, et cetera, which have, I don't know, runs of 50,000 or something, it becomes really, it's much cheaper to do this, as it was also in mass magazines in America. And I actually, in a separate essay, I have actually wondered, so why does Life and Time and these American media, are they in advance of other mass media that are in very advanced industrialized nations? And I realized the demographics favor doing much bigger runs until the Nazis decide in World War II, we're going to do a run as big as Life, but we're going to do the pictures and the text separately so we can have a French edition, a Spanish edition, a Czech edition, a Polish edition, and try to actually court local populace with our text, but also court them with color images of how well the Nazis are doing. So it's only when, but they could not do this just with a German population or with any smaller country population. The US population was much bigger. If you go to Wikipedia and you look up, for 1939, there is a comparative list of populations. And first you think, oh my God, the British population is so much bigger than American, so why don't they have any color covers or much color advertising? But then Wikipedia's chart has something about disaggregation, and you go and you realize, oh, wait a second, we're talking about the British Empire, which has like 300 million Indians and whatever. So, and when it gets down to the British Isles, we're talking about, I want to say 1/6 the probable population of middle class and upper class who might be buying magazines on a weekly basis at the newsstand than one would find in America. And this was also true in France, when, I mean, they have much bigger populations until you disaggregate the subaltern colonial populations. And it seems to me that America, even when the middle class is pressed during the Great Depression, has a much bigger middle class that can buy magazines, and that therefore advertisers and also manufacturers think, let's explore consumer obsolescence and put color on things, which is what my much older dissertation was about, and for which we then need color photography. But also the advertising won't be so expensive if we're talking about runs in the 500,000 to many millions. I mean, Life started at 500,000 and within a year was up to 2 million, which made, so in terms of getting back to your question, it seems to me by the time there's university public education, and so there are these big whales of art history textbooks, you're going to see color plates enter. But Kozloff, but I can't answer the question because I don't know when does Gardner, you all should go and do a little research on this in terms of your own, but when do color plates start entering? But I think when Kozloff is writing, he's saying, he's implying that it's very new, that art history as taught in both slides and congruently in books is going to have color plates. And I think that really starts only in the 70s. And he said, up till then, the professors were trained to only stress diseño, not colore, and to have black and white slides. And it's only in the late 60s that this starts to shift into color slides. And I think this would be true in the larger books. And frequently through the 70s and 80s, still publishers said, you can have 4 color plates, or you could, we'll do black and white, but color is simply too expensive if we're talking about academic publishers. But then there are these machine publishers for academic textbooks like Gardner that can really sort of count on, we're doing a run of 50,000 or something. But I'm actually speculating here. I want to now go back and go through all editions of Gardner.
I would wonder, I never saw a Johnson with black and white images only, but it does have mostly the big Johnson art history books. Yeah, it has, I think, almost all are color, and that is expensive for a textbook.
Of course it is, but I actually think if one goes back, I don't know when Johnson started competing with Gardner, but I think if you go back to the 60s, if they were already publishing in the 60s, and some of you can already check this out on Google while we're talking, that then you would see that they had black and white, and then they were making a conversion.
It's a good question for historiography students. So
exactly.
I will think of that in my next class. And something very similar was happening with the magazines in Mexico. Also, advertisement, almost always in color.
And I'm sorry, I don't remember off the top the Kozlov essay, but it's a very important essay, circa 75, that appeared in Art Forum, and then I think is reprinted in one of his books. Though I think in one of his books there are not color images because it was too expensive in a small run.
We'll have our librarian look for it.
And it will also be interesting not just to look at art history textbooks, both the big runs and the smaller runs, but to also look at art magazines. Because up until the 60s, it's all black and white. And then because the gallerists and museums start advertising with color, and then they can afford to add color printing, because often you're talking about a signature, and so they would start doing more and more color. But I haven't done that, but I think it's a fabulous issue to raise in terms of art magazines, including Kozlov's own Art Forum.
Okay, thank you. ¿Más preguntas? ¿Alguien? ¿Tenemos del público en línea, quizá? Jay?
Aquí.
I just wanted to know if you could ruminate a little bit on the Barth's use of the word cosmetic. You talked about it a little bit in terms of and he talks about it in terms of the dead corpse being painted. But of course, and I don't know if this is something you talk about somewhere else, but cosmetics have a feminine connotation too. And of course, a lot of the advertisements in these mainstream magazines are about cosmetics, and you can't talk about red lipstick or blush without color. There's almost no purpose of it. And so there's an association not only with the funerary, the undertaker, but with the dolled up woman or the trollop or even the prostitute or whatever, whose colored features are considered artificial, gauche, or even vulgar,
But also the dandy. I mean, going back to sort of somewhat coded gay culture in the 19th century, Oscar Wilde he did not use makeup, but he used lots of color, et cetera. Joyce he's seen as a dandy, but a heterosexual dandy. Barth, I think, first of all, Camera Lucida was written right after his mother's death. And his mother came from a very upper class French level, Huguenot, not Catholic, but I can imagine that his mother used very little, disdained cosmetics, etc. I mean, she might have used a bit of lipstick, but this is what Bourdieu would call sort of the distinction of the upper class, is to avoid all these mass media, middle class trends, etc., and even to disdain starlets and vedettes, etc.
And disdain color and clothing too, because you're talking about the clothing, brightly colored clothing being produced in Germany, but you know, if you look at an upper class French woman of this, you know, period, 30s, 40s, is she really wearing that brightly colored clothing, or is she? I don't know.
I think we have to treat that as a question that needs to be, I think actually the couture houses are featuring a lot of color. But I'm not sure that the truly upper class were going to, I mean, they might have gone to their private seamstresses and tailors, but not to the couture house. I mean, it's like the nouveau riche as opposed to old rich, et cetera. But we need to do more work on this in terms of.
So I just want to make one little slippage here
Please.
with your, you know, something you write about in the Mexichrome catalog at the end of your essay, which is about your, and in fact, your whole essay is a little bit structured at the beginning and the end about a resistance to the inclusion of this other perverted form, which is the colorized photograph, either the 19th or early 20th century studio photograph, where the colors are often extremely garish and applied like makeup. In fact, the faces of women's portraits, such as we have in the show, you'll see there's one, it just looks like she's wearing makeup, and the paint has been applied as makeup is applied. And then, of course, this gets introduced in a digital era where, you know, you've written about your antipathy to the digitalized colorization of black and white originals, whether in film or fixed media. So that is the chromophobia that circulates around seems to me deeply implicated with this whole idea of the makeup, the artificiality, not only of death, but of this hyper life in the lived, and particularly a female side, since men, quote, are not supposed to wear makeup. I don't know if you just.
I think I internalize both the chromophilic and the chromophobic. And I think in the essay, I tried to point to that as well. I actually, I've only glanced at the copy that Karen showed me of Mexichrome, but I was shocked to see the Tina Modotti portrait of Mela colored. I mean, and Karen, I think, also said, I've never seen this before, correct?
And perhaps colored by, I speculate that it was colored by her. Because we have evidence that she hand-colored, she hand-tinted black and white photographs that she was taking of Diego Rivera's murals. Bruno Traven owned some and said to interviewers that they had been hand-tinted by Modotti herself. That she was actually, yes. Yes, but you see, this is where,
Yes.
but you see, this is chromophobic idea that the idea is Tina Modotti is so noble, and in fact once writes in one of her essays on photography that the photographer can never manipulate or in any way touch, but we know that she did manipulate and she did retouch, and so did Weston. So these people, like you say, you know, they are.
They're talking out of two sides of
yes,
their mouths.
and they
their
are, yeah, they're not always trustworthy in terms of their phobias and philias.
And also, let's remember about Tina that she both embodies. She was a little starlet, right? She, and Hollywood was very interested in the garish and the vulgar, et cetera. And then she like hooks up with Weston and becomes much more political when she goes to Mexico. So I think there are two sides of her in terms of her own life. I mean, then she becomes like a crazy Stalinist.
But I'll just end with this, and that is that colorized Maya photograph, whether she did it or not, humanizes him. So this idea that these photographs are humanizing the intellectual and making that intellectual more relatable to an audience, to even a mass audience. And if it's a postcard, it's designed for a mass audience that makes this person into a human and not an abstraction, and actually pulls them out of the realm of art, pulls Maya out of the realm of art and puts it into the realm of life.
Yeah, closer to life.
I wish I'd had time to talk more about that Maya thing in my essay, but that's what Mexichrome is about, provocation.
Yes, as I plan to in the next day. Yes.
Well, I have a question, but I'm going to make it in Spanish, so I think I can phrase it better. Trabajo con Bob Chadwick, holandés, fotógrafo holandés, que llegó a México en 1958. Yes.
Déjame traducir. Está diciendo que ella trabaja con Bob Chalwick. que
But
son
that will be in English.
Sorry, oh God. I'm like, okay. She's saying that it's the code switching is very difficult for me. So she is saying that she works with Bob Shalwick, who is present here, who is a photographer who came to Mexico in
From the Netherlands, yes.
from the Netherlands in 1958.
1958.
Yeah. And
1958.
And his work, I didn't know, but already admired when I looked at the book, the Mexichrome book. I went, who is this guy? I don't know him.
That was him.
okay,
And
next sentence.
I just find out that his first photographs that I know they were taken in black and white, he actually took at least a film in color. But we just found a print that they all fade out. And also some of his earlier films, color films, from also 1959 in color, they're kind of fade out. How do you think about if we digitalize them and recover the color, because that actually can make through Photoshop? Is that would be accurate or I don't know how to manage that.
Gracias. I think it's a great question. And first of all, it was only in World War II that Kodak is enjoined. We cannot be sending things back to Rochester. We need pictures also for aerial reconnaissance that we develop in the field. And so Kodak was directed by the government. We cannot continue to rely on Kodachrome. And they developed the earliest form of Ektachrome, which is then developed through the 50s and into the 60s with better speeds and blah, blah, blah. And that could be actually processed by any photographer who wanted to set up shop to do such a thing. It was still complicated, and you had to really maintain very good temperature control with Ektachrome, which in terms of processing, I mean, that's why you send it to a factory like Kodak for the Kodachrome. It was like absolute precision in terms of maintaining temperature control through the process, or pretty close, as close as one can get. So even when I was speaking or emailing with Jay, he said, well, what about this? And you think it's an Ektachrome? And I said, or maybe I'm mixing this up. I said, I think it's probably from the 50s, a Kodachrome, but not an Ektachrome, because the Ektachromes are notorious for going bad, for fading. And the Kodachromes are remarkable for their stability. I mean, in the first 2 years and 4 months, there was a separate formula used with the Kodachrome, and some of those have faded. But since there were some complaints about this isn't really coming out as we hoped, they completely reorganized their formulas. And ever since 38, the Kodachromes, until it stopped production, have remarkable stability. Now, of course, if someone leaves a box of Kodachromes in a glove compartment of a car and it bakes in the heat, as often happens with things in glove compartments, you're going to see some fading and movement of the color, et cetera. But Kodachromes are really a marvel of stability. Much other color, and certainly Ektachrome, and also Agfacolor Noi was not a marvel of stability. Now, so I thought I should explain that. I imagine that you were not working with Kodachrome if it went, unless you put it in the glove compartment or the oven, but it was Ektachrome rather than Kodachrome, which is a completely different system than Kodachrome. But I am not a chemist, and I'm not going to attempt to explain the different system. But it was designed so that people could process it, or small labs could process it, as opposed to it had to be shipped to a Kodak factory. I have mixed feelings about what does it mean for us to reconstruct, to say, well, this is exactly how it would have looked, because I think we never know exactly how it looked in the past. And we're producing a kind of false illusion that we can match in this way. My essay ends talking about various films, and especially one new film working with World War I film that is very cleverly and sensitively colorized, all this old black and white footage. And yet I think this is this is all based on a kind of speculation, ultimately informed by our current ideas of what grass should look like, what red shirts would look like, what this would look like, what that. So so all of this colorization of past stuff, whether it be faded color or whether it be black and white, which we're trying to bring up to date, is very specious, debatable. And so I have mixed feelings, but especially in the case of ectochrome, I think it might be worth doing if one sort of presents it with a certain caveat, makes clear this isn't the film that we found, but we have tried to approximate what we imagine to be what it originally looked like.
Could I just, as curator, something that's come up basically since the show opened in conversations with photographers more than with art historians is, and this pertains specifically to Bob, in an example I could use, when you are printing photographs today from slide originals or film originals that have been digitized, and now you're going to do an inkjet type of print.
But ultimately, you're doing 4-color printing on a press.
On a
roll.
press.
Yes.
But,
so you're involving engravers,
right.
also interpreting.
But the issue is this: the resolution, the detail, the type of print that you would make today is not a type of print that you would make in 1973. So, for example, the photograph by Bob in the show shows a field of snow. The detail of the footprints and the slight differences in the snow is possible today through digital printing of his film original.
Also, digital scanning is
And scanning.
so improved in the last 20
Right.
years.
That would not have been, that resolution would not have been possible in a laboratory or darkroom in 1973. So, should I, as the curator, have Bob or someone produce the photograph in 2024 to make it look like it had been produced in 1973? Or should I produce it as he wants maybe it to be produced with greater resolution than it could have been produced in 1973? Or should I simply not produce it because it doesn't exist? As some curators would say, the photograph was not produced in 1973 or 75, therefore it cannot be included in an exhibition because there is...
The photograph was produced.
Yes, of course.
But it wasn't necessarily reproduced.
Printed. Yeah.
And what I especially like about the Mexichrome catalog, and really I just glanced at it last night and again this morning, is how much mass media is reprinted there. And it might too have been improved because some of that newspaper has yellowed, et cetera, and they went, let's get rid of some of this yellowing from age, et cetera. Just as I wish, let's get rid of yellowing and wrinkles, whatever.
Makeup.
Makeup. Some things are beyond makeup at this point. Botox maybe, but not just makeup, it seems to me. Whatever. But I like giving the sense of this is how it was presented at the time. Though there will be, one has to decide how much you want to actually upgrade what you have in terms of the archival material to make it more both presentable and likable for the current generation.
Right. So there's no, for what I learned through this project really as a photo curator, working with both existing photographs that could be borrowed from a period, sebachromes and Kodachromes that are perfectly, intact, or making new prints, there is no single body of rules. There is no single, there are ethical, taste related, personal taste related. There are, and for as many photographers and curators, there are as many different views. And it was eye-opening for me, but.
And I thank you for all the good questions. Thank you.
Hello. I think from the title and the presentation, I deduce that there's some dual relationship with Freund's, color and black and white photography. I think my question is, once Freund finds success in her color work, does she completely divorce from the black and white practice, or does it continue in the background?
Good question. She pretty much jettisons black and white work as more and more magazines use increasing amounts of color in the 50s and 60s. In the 40s, she's still juggling. She does a story about Perón and what's her name? Evita, which is, she goes into Evita's closet, which is like, what's the Filipina? Marcos, it's like another, and it's not in color. And I think, why are you not doing color in the closet? Life may have told her, sorry, we're not printing that much color right now. Life sort of, the business manager would say how much editorial color you could have in any one issue, et cetera. And there may have been some color shots of the closet as well. I don't know, and the archive in France does not have it. So then I'm just depending on what I see in the magazine at the time. But the curiosity is that in her Photography and Society, which is a kind of updating of her first thesis published as a book in 1936, that appears in the 70s and is very important, especially for sort of lefty photo and art historians, in terms of getting back to, let's think about social needs and how that actually is a kind of motor for new changes in culture. The cover is in black and white, and she speaks very little here about the rise of color in mass media, even though this is her bread and butter at the time. And I think it's a way of, in some ways, removing herself. I mean, deciding I'm not going to talk about myself, I'll talk about the field. But in some ways, by not talking about it, she ignores major historical changes in the field by the 70s.
That some of these photos were taken in color and printed in black and white?
There's a chance. It's a good question, and I have no answer for it. I think most of that printing in black and white from color Kodachromes and ectochromes starts really in the 60s, and by the 60s, I mean, her career is pretty much. That's why she starts returning to writing, and then returning to sort of publicizing her own work and its archive in the 70s and 80s, and even in the 90s. But I went to the one extant archive out in Normandy near the D-Day landing. I'm trying to remember, what is the name of this town whose name I can't properly pronounce. There was nothing there. So I can't say, it's a good question though. But I think this is really from the 60s when people talked about, yeah, they can shoot color, but if we don't have the money for it, or then we just print it as, we do a darkroom conversion and then send it to the printer. I don't think that was done very often in the late 30s and 40s and even 50s. I thank you for your patience. I hope I didn't go over. And it's an honor to meet a photographer whose work I only encountered in the last 24 hours. So that's very exciting. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for accompanying us.
Thank you.